For years, these cases seemed destined to remain mysteries forever. Families waited for answers that never came. Detectives exhausted every lead. Witnesses disappeared, evidence grew cold, and hope slowly faded with each passing year. Many people believed the truth would never be uncovered. But advances in forensic science, genetic genealogy, and relentless investigative work would eventually change everything. In today's video, we'll examine 3 cold cases that everyone had given up on. Cases that remained unsolved for years, and in some instances, decades, before shocking breakthroughs finally revealed what really happened. From a young victim whose killer appeared to vanish without a trace, to a mystery that baffled investigators for years before a single piece of evidence changed everything. These stories prove that no secret stays buried forever. Let's begin. Frank McAlister was only 19 years old when he disappeared in the spring of 1993. For nearly 25 years, his family searched for answers. Investigators chased dead ends, and the people responsible kept a secret that seemed destined to stay buried forever. Then, in a twist few could have imagined, one of the killers walked into a television news station and confessed on camera. Born on September 20th, 1973, Frank McAlister was known as the kind of person who could make friends wherever he went. Family members remembered him as funny, outgoing, and always looking for a way to make people laugh. Fishing was one of his greatest passions, something he shared with his father after moving to Redding, California as a child. Summers were spent by the water, casting lines and dreaming about the future. By 1993, Frank was working as a cook and planning a new chapter in his life. He was engaged to his girlfriend, Donald Tadek, and the couple talked about getting married and moving away to start fresh. Frank had struggled with methamphetamine use, but those close to him believed he was trying to turn things around. Earlier that year, he had been involved in a car accident and received an insurance settlement worth roughly $5,000. To Frank, the money represented opportunity, but instead of using it as a foundation for his future, he became convinced he could quickly increase it by purchasing methamphetamine and reselling it for profit. It was a decision that would cost him his life. Frank shared his plan with several acquaintances, including siblings Curtis and Shanna Culver, and Shanna's boyfriend Brian Hawkins. Unknown to Frank, the 3 had already begun discussing a plan of their own. They knew he was carrying cash, and rather than help him make money, they intended to take it from him. On May 6, 1993, Frank borrowed Donald's car and picked up the 3 acquaintances. Brian Hawkins sat directly behind him. Curtis Culver took the front passenger seat, while Shauna sat in the rear. The group headed toward Shingletown, a remote area east of Redding surrounded by forests and mountain roads. Hawkins claimed he knew people there who could supply the drugs Frank wanted to buy. Frank had no reason to doubt him. As they drove deeper into the wilderness, Frank believed he was getting closer to a business deal. In reality, he was driving toward an ambush. At some point, the group stopped in a secluded area far from witnesses. What happened next would remain hidden for decades. According to later confessions and court records, Frank was attacked inside and outside the vehicle. The exact sequence of events became a point of dispute among the suspects, with each blaming the others. What investigators eventually established was that both Brian Hawkins and Curtis Culver participated in the deadly assault. Frank was stabbed multiple times. He desperately tried to escape the vehicle, but there was nowhere to run. The attack continued until he collapsed. The violence did not end there. After Frank was mortally wounded, his attackers dragged him away from the road and left his body in the woods. Then they returned to the car, took his money, and drove back toward Redding. Along the way, they attempted to erase evidence. Blood inside the vehicle was wiped down with newspapers and clothing. The car was eventually abandoned in a Costco parking lot before the group disappeared into the city. The following morning, Donald knew something was wrong. Frank had not come home. She filed a missing persons report and informed investigators about the money he had recently received and his plan to purchase drugs. That same day, authorities located the abandoned vehicle. The scene immediately alarmed investigators. Blood was visible on the exterior of the driver's door. More blood stained the armrest, interior panels, and items left inside the vehicle. Detectives quickly concluded that this was far more than a missing persons case. The amount of blood suggested a homicide. Police soon learned that Brian Hawkins and the Culver siblings had been among the last people seen with Frank. When questioned, all three provided the same story. They claimed Frank had dropped them off at a park in Reading before leaving to meet someone else. The account sounded rehearsed. But investigators had a major problem. They had no body. Without knowing exactly what had happened or where it had happened, there was little evidence capable of tying anyone to a murder charge. Despite repeated interviews, the three suspects maintained their story and refused to provide additional information. Months passed. Then, in April 1994, a breakthrough finally arrived. A person exploring a remote wooded area near Shingletown discovered human remains scattered across the forest floor. Animals and exposure had taken their toll, but investigators recovered enough evidence to identify the victim through dental records. The remains belonged to Frank McAlister. For Frank's family, the discovery brought both devastation and relief. The worst fears they had carried for nearly a year were confirmed, but at least they finally knew where he was. The autopsy revealed evidence of multiple stab wounds, supporting what detectives had long suspected. Frank had been murdered. Despite the discovery, the investigation remained stalled. Detectives continued interviewing Hawkins and the Culvers, but the three remained silent. No one confessed. No new witnesses emerged. Physical evidence connecting specific individuals to the killing was limited. As the years passed, the case slowly grew cold. For Frank's mother, the passage of time brought no peace. Birthdays came and went. Holidays passed. Questions remained unanswered. The young man who had once dreamed of marriage and a future never had the chance to grow older. Meanwhile, the people believed responsible continued living their lives. Then, after nearly 25 years, something extraordinary happened. On January 9, 2018, 45-year-old Brian Hawkins walked into the KRCR television station in Reading. The camera was already rolling. Hawkins appeared emotional as he explained why he had come. He said he had spent decades haunted by what happened in 1993. He described living with guilt, regret, and what he called a nightmare that never ended. Then he made a stunning announcement. He said he was about to walk next door to the sheriff's department and confess to murder. According to Hawkins, years of guilt and a growing religious faith had pushed him toward the decision. He admitted that he, Curtis Culver, and Shauna Culver had robbed Frank and participated in the events that led to his death. The television station immediately contacted authorities. Investigators moved quickly. Within hours, Hawkins repeated his confession to detectives. Armed with new information, police tracked down Curtis and Shauna Culver and brought them in for questioning. For the first time in nearly a quarter century, the wall of silence began to crack. The suspects offered conflicting versions of what happened that day. Hawkins blamed Curtis for initiating the attack. Curtis blamed Hawkins for carrying out the stabbing. Shauna largely attempted to maintain the same story she had told investigators years earlier. But after 25 years, the truth was finally emerging. All three were arrested. For Frank's family, the moment was almost impossible to believe. The case that had haunted them since 1993 was finally moving toward justice. In November 2019, Brian Hawkins pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and robbery. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Years later, Curtis and Shauna Culver also entered pleas related to their roles in the crime. Though legal outcomes differed, all three were finally held accountable for the events that had remained hidden for decades. The resolution brought long-awaited answers, but it could never restore what had been taken. Frank McAlister was 19 years old when he left home on May 6, 1993. He believed he was taking a shortcut toward a better future. Instead, he encountered three people who saw his hopes as an opportunity. For nearly 25 years, his family lived with uncertainty, while the truth remained locked inside the minds of those responsible. In the end, it wasn't new technology, forensic science, or a surprise witness that solved the case. It was guilt, a burden carried for decades by one of the killers until it became too heavy to bear. And with a single confession, a mystery that had endured for almost a quarter century finally came to an end. When Cynthia Gonzalez disappeared in September 1991, investigators believed they knew exactly what kind of person they were searching for. Everything about the crime seemed to point toward a male killer. Cynthia was 25 years old, a mother, and an exotic dancer who occasionally performed at private events. On the night she vanished, she had arranged to meet a male client for one of those performances. When her body was later discovered dumped in a rural ditch, she had been stripped naked and left exposed to the elements. To detectives, the case appeared straightforward in one respect. The person responsible was almost certainly a man. For more than 3 decades, that assumption shaped the investigation. On September 16, 1991, Cynthia dropped her 6-year-old daughter off at her ex-husband's home before heading out to work. It was a routine day. She expected to return home later that evening. She never did. When Cynthia failed to come back, concern quickly spread among those who knew her. Her ex-husband reported her missing the following day, and investigators immediately began searching for answers. Police soon located Cynthia's abandoned vehicle near the area where she was supposed to meet her client. The discovery raised immediate alarm. Her car had been left behind, but there was no sign of Cynthia herself. As detectives worked to piece together her final movements, every hour that passed increased fears that something terrible had happened. 5 days later, those fears became reality. A property owner in rural Johnson County discovered a body dumped in a ditch along a remote country road. The location was roughly 30 minutes from where Cynthia's car had been found. The victim was Cynthia Gonzalez. She had been shot multiple times in the chest. The condition of the body immediately complicated the investigation. The Texas heat had accelerated decomposition, and several rainstorms had further damaged the scene. Detectives struggled to determine exactly what had happened during Cynthia's final hours. Because of the condition of the remains, investigators could not conclusively determine whether sexual assault had occurred. Potential forensic evidence that might have identified a suspect had either deteriorated or been washed away. From the beginning, the case faced enormous obstacles. The lead detective assigned to the investigation was Jim Ford. Determined to find Cynthia's killer, Ford spent years following every possible lead. Given the circumstances of the crime, investigators focused heavily on the men in Cynthia's life. The male client she was supposed to meet became an immediate person of interest. Former partners, acquaintances, co-workers, and other men connected to Cynthia were scrutinized. Detectives examined motives, verified alibis, and chased every promising lead they could find. But one by one, those leads collapsed. No suspect could be linked to the crime. No forensic evidence identified a killer. No witness came forward with the answer investigators desperately needed. Years passed, then more years passed. Despite Ford's relentless efforts, the case remained unsolved. According to detectives who later reviewed the file, Ford spent nearly 2 decades working the investigation. He examined virtually every male suspect connected to Cynthia and systematically eliminated them. Before his death in 2013, he never made an arrest. For Cynthia's family, the unanswered questions became a permanent part of life. Her daughter Jessica was only 6 years old when her mother was murdered. Most of her memories came from photographs and stories shared by family members. As the years turned into decades, hope slowly faded. No arrests, no charges, no justice. By 2024, Cynthia's murder had remained unsolved for 33 years. Then an unlikely group entered the investigation: college students. The Arlington Police Department did not have a dedicated cold case unit. Active homicide detectives were constantly balancing new murders with decades-old investigations. As a result, many cold cases received only limited attention whenever time allowed. Patricia Eddings, a criminology professor at the University of Texas at Arlington and a former forensic analyst, believed there might be another solution. After hearing detectives discuss the challenge of finding time to review cold cases, she proposed a partnership between the university and the police department. Selected students would examine old case files and provide fresh perspectives. The department agreed. 15 criminology students were given access to thousands of pages of documents, including witness statements, handwritten notes, crime scene photographs, laboratory reports, and investigative summaries. Among those files was the murder of Cynthia Gonzalez. What started as a classroom assignment quickly became an obsession. Students arrived hours before class began. They stayed long after class ended. Some estimated they spent more than 100 hours reviewing the case. As they worked through the mountain of paperwork, one detail continued to stand out. A woman's name appeared repeatedly throughout the investigative files. Again and again, students encountered references to the same individual. The more they reviewed the documents, the more convinced they became that the woman deserved a closer look. Eventually, they approached Detective Anthony Stafford with a series of questions. Had she been fully investigated? Had her husband been interviewed? Had her fingerprints ever been compared to evidence? Had detectives collected DNA from her? The questions caught Stafford's attention immediately. Up to that point, he had been following the same path investigators had followed for decades. Like everyone else, he had assumed the killer was male. But the student's observations were impossible to ignore. Stafford and his partner pulled every document they could find relating to the woman and began re-examining the evidence line by line. What they discovered shocked them. The woman's name was Janie Perkins. According to investigators, Perkins and Cynthia had once been friends. They spent time together and shared many of the same social connections. Then a man entered the picture. Both women became romantically involved with him. Eventually, the man chose Cynthia. Investigators learned that he ended his relationship with Perkins in order to pursue one with Cynthia. Detectives believe the decision left Perkins furious. As Stafford continued digging through the old files, he uncovered information that had largely been forgotten. In 1993, two separate men had approached police and provided sworn statements claiming that Perkins confessed to the murder. What made the statements remarkable was that the two men did not know one another, yet both reportedly described Perkins providing details about the crime that investigators believed only someone involved would know. The statements were strikingly similar. One of the men had actually dated Perkins before leaving her for Cynthia, placing him at the center of the alleged love triangle investigators believed motivated the crime. Detectives also discovered that Perkins did not have a confirmed alibi for the night Cynthia was murdered. According to investigators, she later failed two separate polygraph examinations. For Stafford, the question became obvious. If all of this information existed in the early 1990s, why wasn't anyone arrested? The answer appeared to lie in the limitations of the evidence available at the time. Polygraph results are not admissible in court. Detectives had no forensic evidence linking Perkins directly to the crime scene. Prosecutors in the early 1990s often wanted a definitive piece of physical evidence before approving murder charges. Without that evidence, the case stalled. Now, more than 3 decades later, investigators viewed the same information through a very different lens. On November 6, 2025, Arlington police announced a major breakthrough. 63-year-old Janie Perkins had been arrested and charged with capital murder in Cynthia Gonzalez's death. For Jessica Roberts, the news was almost impossible to process. For 34 years, her mother's case had remained unsolved. Now there was finally an arrest. The students who helped revive the investigation were equally emotional. Some reportedly broke down in tears after learning the case they had spent months studying had led to a suspect being taken into custody. For a brief moment, it appeared that justice might finally be within reach. Then came another twist. After reviewing the evidence, a Tarrant County grand jury declined to indict Perkins. Prosecutors cited the harsh reality faced by many cold cases. Witnesses disappear. Memories fade. Evidence is lost. Technologies that exist today were unavailable decades earlier. Without sufficient admissible evidence to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, the grand jury chose not to move forward. The decision devastated Cynthia's family. But Jessica Roberts refused to give up hope. She publicly stated that a no-bill decision was not the same as a finding of innocence and insisted that the fight for justice was not over. Today, more than 3 decades after Cynthia Gonzalez left for work and never came home, her murder officially remains unsolved. Yet her case has already accomplished something remarkable. A group of students reviewing forgotten files succeeded in uncovering leads that had sat buried for decades. Their work reignited an investigation many believed would never move again and inspired similar partnerships across the country. For Cynthia's family, the search for justice continues. For investigators, the door remains open. And for the woman whose life was taken in 1991, hope remains alive that one day the final chapter of her story will finally be written. On the morning of August 15, 1975, 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington left her family's home in Broomall, Pennsylvania, carrying her Bible and heading toward the final day of summer Bible camp. It should have been an ordinary walk. The camp was less than half a mile away, and Gretchen had made the trip several times that week without incident. Her family lived in a quiet, suburban community where children regularly walked to church, rode bicycles through the neighborhood, and played outside until dinner. Danger was something that happened somewhere else. That morning was especially important for the Harrington family. Gretchen's mother was returning home from the hospital with a newborn baby girl. The family was preparing to welcome the newest member of the household. Excitement filled the home as Gretchen's older sisters stayed behind to greet their mother and new sibling. Gretchen, however, wanted to attend the final day of Bible camp. She had not missed a single day all week and was looking forward to receiving a perfect attendance certificate. Shortly before 9:30 that morning, neighbors saw her walking confidently along Lawrence Road toward Trinity Chapel. It was the last confirmed sighting of Gretchen Harrington alive. When she failed to arrive at camp, concern began to spread. Friends eventually showed up at the Harrington home, asking where Gretchen was. Assuming she had already returned, they were shocked to learn she never made it there. Her father immediately began searching the area. As the hours passed, panic replaced confusion. Police were notified, and one of the people who helped report Gretchen missing was a local pastor named David Zanstra. At the time, nobody found that unusual. Zanstra was a respected church leader, a family friend, and someone deeply involved in the Bible camp Gretchen attended. His own daughter was friends with Gretchen. He appeared to be just another concerned member of the community, desperate to find a missing child. Within hours, one of the largest searches in the area's history was underway. Hundreds of volunteers combed fields, neighborhoods, creeks, and wooded areas. Search dogs followed Gretchen's scent trail until it suddenly stopped. The discovery was troubling. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence she had run away, no indication she had been forcibly taken. Investigators began to suspect that Gretchen had willingly entered a vehicle belonging to someone she trusted. As tips flooded in, witnesses repeatedly described seeing a green station wagon near the route Gretchen had taken that morning. The information was logged, but with dozens of leads pouring in, investigators struggled to determine which details truly mattered. Days turned into weeks. Then, nearly 2 months after Gretchen vanished, a jogger made a horrifying discovery inside Ridley Creek State Park. Hidden in a wooded area roughly 2.5 miles from where Gretchen was last seen, human remains were found. Dental records confirmed the victim was Gretchen Harrington. The community was devastated. The medical examiner determined that she had died from severe blunt force trauma to the head. Someone had murdered an 8-year-old child and abandoned her body in the woods. Yet despite one of the largest investigations the area had ever seen, police could not identify the killer. The case slowly began to grow cold. For Gretchen's family, the loss was unimaginable. Friends remembered her as kind, gentle, and easy to like. Family members often said that anyone who met Gretchen instantly became her friend. As years passed, investigators revisited the case repeatedly. Leads were re-examined, suspects were reviewed, witnesses were interviewed again, but no arrest was ever made. Meanwhile, David Zanstra continued living his life. After leaving Pennsylvania, he served in churches in other states, including Texas and Georgia. To many people, he remained a respected religious figure. For decades, nobody publicly connected him to Gretchen's murder. Then, nearly 50 years after the crime, something changed. Interest in the case was revived by journalists researching Gretchen's disappearance. Their work encouraged old witnesses to come forward and share information they had carried for decades. One of those witnesses would become the turning point in the investigation. The woman had been one of David Zanstra's daughter's closest childhood friends. As a child, she frequently spent the night at the Zanstra home. During one sleepover in 1975, she later told investigators that she awoke to find Zanstra touching her inappropriately. When she told his daughter what had happened, she claimed the girl responded by saying that her father sometimes behaved that way. The experience disturbed her deeply. Shortly after Gretchen disappeared, the young girl wrote something in her diary. For decades, the entry remained hidden. Nearly half a century later, she showed investigators what she had written as a child. The diary entry stated that she believed Mr. Z might be responsible for Gretchen's disappearance. To detectives, the significance was enormous. This was not a memory created years later. It was a suspicion documented in real time by a child living through the events as they unfolded. The information prompted investigators to take a fresh look at David Zanstra. As they re-examined old witness statements, additional details began to stand out. Several witnesses had reported seeing a green station wagon near Gretchen on the morning she disappeared. Zanstra owned a green station wagon. Investigators also discovered that during the original investigation, Zanstra had provided an unusually detailed description of Gretchen's clothing, despite claiming he had not seen her that morning. The more detectives reviewed the evidence, the more questions they had. In July 2023, Pennsylvania State Police traveled to Georgia to interview the now 83-year-old former pastor. What began as a routine interview quickly became something far more significant. According to investigators, Zanstra admitted that he saw Gretchen walking to Bible camp that morning and offered her a ride. Because she knew him and trusted him, she got into his vehicle. Investigators said Zanstra confessed that instead of driving Gretchen to camp, he took her to a secluded area. When she resisted his actions and demanded to go home, he attacked her. Authorities allege that he killed her before leaving her body in the woods and returning to continue his day as though nothing had happened. The confession stunned investigators. For nearly 5 decades, the mystery that had haunted an entire community finally appeared to have an answer. David Zanstra was arrested and charged with murder and kidnapping. For Gretchen's family, the news brought emotions that were difficult to describe. After almost 50 years without answers, there was finally a suspect. Family members remembered Gretchen as a child who radiated kindness and warmth. Even decades after her death, people still shared stories about the impact she had made on those around her. The arrest seemed to bring them one step closer to justice. Yet the legal battle that followed proved far more complicated. Defense attorneys challenged the confession and argued that Zanstra's age and health issues made it unreliable. They also questioned aspects of the investigation and the evidence. In January 2025, after hearing the case, a Delaware County jury found David Zanstra not guilty. The verdict shocked many observers. For some, it meant the case had once again returned to uncertainty. For investigators, however, the arrest marked the culmination of decades of work and a belief that they had finally identified the person responsible for Gretchen's death. Today, Gretchen Harrington's murder remains one of Pennsylvania's most discussed cold cases. What began as a short walk to Bible camp became a mystery that lasted nearly half a century. An entire community grew up with questions. Families waited decades for answers. And although the legal outcome remains debated, the investigation ultimately provided a name, a confession, and a theory of what happened on that summer morning in 1975. For those who knew Gretchen, she remains far more than a cold case. She is remembered as the cheerful 8-year-old girl who never missed a day of Bible camp, who made friends wherever she went, and whose story continues to resonate nearly 50 years after she disappeared on a quiet suburban street. Her family spent decades searching for the truth. And even today, Gretchen Harrington's name remains a reminder that some mysteries refuse to be forgotten. If these stories reminded you how long justice can take, let us know in the comments which case affected you the most. And if you enjoy true crime stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more cold cases and criminal investigations. Thanks for watching.